Hi guys, my name's Kathleen Kennedy and I'm going to be talking to you today about Life of Pi by Jan Martel. It's a story about a young boy named Pacine and his journey living on a lifeboat and fighting to survive, accompanied by a tiger. Being stuck on a lifeboat, all of the animals and Pi are forced to fight for survival and do whatever it takes. We hear about Pi's story, and he describes to us the things he witnesses on the lifeboat, things unimaginable to many people, things that you could never even think would happen. The animals and Pi are completely desperate. They don't know what to eat, what to drink, or where to go. They're in complete shock from the accident, and so it is hard for them to make good decisions and act in a sane way when they're so hurt and in shock by what just occurred to them. But Pi manages to keep his faith and stay strong, and he actually is, at the beginning, refraining from doing anything, just acting on instinct. He, unlike the hyena, who just goes and kills the orangutan and the zebra, eating them for food, Pi thinks it through, thinks about what he can do to have food, to get water, everything like that. Like, he's logical with how he is going to stay alive. He wants to stay alive just as much as the other characters, but he wants to do it in a way that he will be able to live with himself after he is saved. Soon it becomes clear that everything else is inferior to staying alive. The characters have one goal, which is to simply live. They'll do anything it takes, and the fact that everything is inferior to being able to stay alive and doing what it is necessary to do, the theme of primacy to survive is clearly portrayed. Therefore, through the characters' immoral actions and complete desperation, it becomes evident that they have put staying alive as their main priority, thus conveying the entire theme of primacy to survive throughout the novel. Pi's strong faith and religion leaves him feeling completely guilty about even his temptation to eat meat. He's been a strict vegetarian his entire life, so when he is faced with the fact that he might actually have to eat meat and have to go against his previous values, he feels a huge sense of guilt. Over time, though, he realizes that he has no other option but to eat meat in order to survive. Therefore, he prioritizes staying alive over his previous morals and values. Pi decides that he will make an exception to fish, and that becomes Richard Parker and his sole source of food. Sadly, it is difficult for the two of them to rely on fish because it's so inconsistent when Pi is fishing. One day, when a blind man runs into Pi and Richard Parker in the middle of the ocean, he tries to kill Pi and eat him. Richard Parker mauls off the blind Frenchman in order to save Pi, but also so that the two of them have a source of food. Pi admits to readers that he does in fact eat some of the man's flesh. I will further confess that, driven by the extremity of my need and the madness to which it pushed me, I ate some of his flesh. I mean small pieces, little strips, that I meant from the gaff's hook that, when dried by the sun, looked like ordinary animal flesh. They slipped into my mouth nearly unnoticed. You must understand, my suffering was unremitting, and he was already dead. As Pi justifies his actions of cannibalism, the theme of primacy to survive is once again present. His action isn't something many of us can understand, yet the situation he is in does seem to justify it. But it is less about whether the action is right or wrong in Pi's case, but more about the fact that he, who used to be such a strict vegetarian, is now at the other extreme, eating a human. It shows the prioritizing that occurs and his complete desperation to live. Richard Parker and the hyena. Each of these characters are animals that actually end up representing humans. They are great contrasts of the character of Pi. From the very beginning, they are crazed by the outrageousness of their situation and act in inhumane ways. The hyena ends up killing the orangutan and the zebra right away. He has barely even experienced the true suffering of starvation, but he is solely thinking of himself. He realizes that in order to survive, he's going to be having to put himself first and acting in ways he may not want to. So, without even being stuck at sea for that long, he immediately kills them and ends up eating them in order to save himself. Orange Juice hit the hyena on the head with her other arm, but the blow only made the beast snarl viciously. She made to bite, but the hyena moved faster. Alas, Orange Juice's defense lacked precision and coherence. Her fear was something useless that only hampered her. The hyena let go of her wrist and expertly got to her throat. To the end, she reminded me of us. Her eyes expressed fear in such a human-like way, as did her strained whimpers. The Blind Frenchman. After running into Pi and Richard Parker in the middle of the water, he calls out to them. The two boats come close, and as soon as they're close enough for the man to touch Pi, he lunges onto him and tries eating him. Pi ends up being safe because of Richard Parker mauling the man to death. It becomes clear that this man had no hesitation to even try and eat Pi. To him, it felt like his only option. It was necessary to keep him alive. So far, it is clear that the plot has been extremely focused on the story of how Pi and Richard Parker survived. Though the two struggle, they do manage to maintain their physical strength and health. But there's actually more to surviving than simply meeting your physical need. The theme of primacy to survive actually looks at both the physical and mental components of survival. Pi's strong faith is what sets him aside from the other characters. Unlike the hyena or Richard Parker, he never lashes out. He's always calm and able to prevent himself from acting on impulse. He also has a lot of hope. He's always hopeful. Though he doesn't really voice it so much during the book, he never just dreads his death or he says, I just give up, I'm gonna die. Instead, he always prays, he hopes for the best, and he talks to God. It is his strong faith that helps him remain as sane as he possibly could. Of course, the situation he is in is so difficult to deal with that there would be issues with his health, mental health at least, after. But he's so dedicated to God and being hopeful that he doesn't do anything that he greatly regrets. Comparing him to Richard Parker kills people, mauls people to death. He is a character who acts in a way that is pure craziness. He does not really consider the consequences of his actions. Pi thinks more about things before he acts. He tries not to be and do immoral things, but if it ends up happening, it does end up happening. But for him, he's so faithful and he's genuinely a good person that he is able to stay strong and stay hopeful and, most of all, stay sane. To choose doubt as a philosophy of life is akin to choosing immobility as a means of transport. Life of Pi, page 28. When Pi is asked by interrogators about his two different stories, the one with animals and the one without, he is asked which one he prefers more. Pi simply replies, "Thank you, and so it goes with God." The University of Oregon looked into this power of faith seen in Life of Pi, determining that he chose the story with Richard Parker and the floating island. That was the story with God, the story in which Pi believed miracles happened and God saved him. It isn't about the truth. Pi proves it's about the faith. The University of Oregon is saying that to Pi, it wasn't the one with the humans that he liked more. He chose the one with the animals not only as a way to cope, but because God was more present in that one. He felt so strongly that God helped him stay alive through that and gave him the courage, the hope, and the strength that he ended up having, that he chose that story because that is the story with God. Looking at the other characters in Life of Pi, for example Richard Parker, he ends up leaving Pi on that island of which they come to. So he just simply walks off and Pi never sees him again. I think this is due to his guilt. He realizes that he will not be able to live with himself, knowing the awful things he did, the completely inhumane actions that he committed. So Pi and Richard Parker are great contrasts of each other, because Pi is so rich in faith and hope, yet Richard Parker has no God, no faith, and we never hear, obviously in the story he's a tiger, but Pi never speaks of any sort of hope, or like Richard Parker is always sad, hiding underneath in the lifeboat. He's never out and about. Obviously there's not much for him to do, but you can tell the difference in between almost every single character and Pi. Pi is more in the moment and thinking of how he is still alive and he maybe will still be alive tomorrow. He dedicates it all to God, meanwhile everyone else is just miserable and thinking, what can I do that will save me? How can I act right now and just do whatever I have to do in order to keep me alive and nobody else. It doesn't matter what happens, just what will keep me alive. And this ends up basically killing them. Richard Parker can't live with himself because of all the awful things he did, but Pi ends up being okay because he was so intact with God and his faiths that he was able to prevent himself from acting in ways that he knew he would regret. So now we're going to do some discussion questions. So, number one is, why do you think Pi's faith is so relevant and necessary to his survival? So I think that Pi's religion is extremely important to the novel, and it's very relevant to who Pi is as a person and his beliefs and values. At the beginning of the book, we see him struggling to find a religion that he truly believes in and can follow, and he ends up finding three. And though the three religions are completely different and have their own doctrines, he finds common ground, and this shows the type of boy that he is. He wants to believe in something good, and he wants to be surrounded by different experiences and stuff like that. So I think even though Pi is ridiculed for believing in such different religions, it's this that keeps him strong and keeps him motivated throughout his entire journey at sea. It's the other characters like Richard Parker just the entire time would just stay under the in the lifeboat and not really try to do anything for themselves. When another human came by, they would maul them and eat them, acting in a complete inhumane way. But Pi instead thought of how he could get fish and how he could consume water. So he actually tried very hard and did something productive for himself. And I think that it's this productivity that is motivated from his faith. He was able to remain stable, and yeah, I think that without his faith and religion, Pi would have been dead. Discussion question number 2 is, does the situation of the characters justify their actions? Why or why not? By this I mean the things they do on the lifeboat, like killing and eating other humans. Is this justified just because they're desperate to survive? So I do feel that the actions of the characters are justified. Their cannibalism, of course, is a disgusting and unbelievable thing to even think of, but in the case of their situation, I think that it was justifiable and continues to be. Although some of the characters did not come about it in a proper way, like for example, the hyena was instantly vicious and killed the orangutan and the zebra, but for example, Pi, he tried so hard not to resort to something as disgusting and cruel as he felt cannibalism was. But eventually, he said, he ended up eating some of the blind man's flesh as if it didn't even slip into his mouth. I think that in a real life situation, thinking back on the plane crash of, I think it was in Andes, Chile, of the rugby team that crashed in the forest and the mountains and were stuck there for 2 months about, and the boys, it was a boys rugby team, they a lot of them were killed by an avalanche or the plane crash, and the survivors were starving and ended up feeding off of the dead passengers. And hearing about this, obviously it's very difficult to even try and imagine, and it's easy to say when you're not in the situation that you would never resort to something like that, but they're not bad people just because the actions that they commit when they're desperate. It would be difficult to just not do it when there's dead passengers right in front of you. Obviously the rugby team felt that if they wanted to stay alive, and they knew that if they did wish to live, then they would have to do something that they maybe did not want to do. It may be disrespectful to the dead, but I do think that in the case of Pi, and also in the real life case of the rugby team in Chile, I think that their actions were definitely justifiable. Number 3 is, why do you believe that Pacine recalled his entire story of his time on the lifeboat using animals instead of people? So I believe that Pi decided to tell the interrogators his story and us his story with animals instead of people as a way to cope with what he just had experienced. And although for me, I didn't quite understand right away that he actually wasn't on a boat with a lion and it was a person, and the hyena was also a person, and the orangutan and the zebra were, but I eventually, when talking to my parents about the book, who they also read it, I realized that, oh my gosh, like he was actually speaking the entire time, and we were unaware that everything that occurred was with humans and not a tiger. Richard Parker was never an actual animal. He never had to tame a tiger. He had to tame a person. And so it's so much more interesting and different, and less, you could say, cruel and vicious of a tiger killing a person as opposed to a person killing and eating a person. So I think that Pi decided to tell the story differently in order to, maybe by saying it and verbalizing it with animals, he can learn to actually remember the story to have happened with animals instead of the people. And it seemed to have worked to help him deal with the awful situation he had experienced. So I truly believe that putting Richard Parker and pinning him as a tiger instead of actually talking about him as a person was a far better way of dealing and telling the story.